London, 1910, just as the gaslights flickered awake along the Mall and the black lacquered carriages of the Coronation Committee clattered past St. James's Palace. Odette Penley kept her head down and her needle steady. Her fingers, brown with dye and nicked from years of work, moved with speed and silence across the silk. The final gold-threaded tassels of Queen Mary's coronation robe gleamed under the lamps of the sewing room. She had stitched for 14 hours, only breaking for tea and a dry heel of bread. The robe was due by morning. But more pressing than time was the letter hidden in the hem. She could feel its weight, even now a folded scrap of linen paper, no bigger than her palm, pressed between layers of silk and thread. It wasn't hers. It belonged to the man who had slipped it under her cutting shears 3 days ago, when the tailors were distracted by the arrival of the Duke of Argyll. She hadn't meant to read it. She had only meant to check that the silk hadn't been damaged. But the name caught her eye. To His Royal Highness, Prince Edward of York. And below it, a signature she would never forget. Xavier Vane. She'd met him only twice. Once in the corridor behind the Queen's dressing chamber, where he had been helping deliver a crate of Belgian lace. The second time, in the chapel antechamber, where she'd caught him sketching crown motifs in the margins of a ledger. He had noticed her watching and had only said, "Some things are too beautiful not to remember." Now she knew who he really was. Xavier Vane, the prince's secret tutor. The American-born son of a disgraced ambassador, taken in by the Duke of Clarence as a ward, and raised within the palace walls under strict orders never to speak above his station. He taught languages to the younger royals and designed coats of arms on the side. And now, apparently, he was passing letters to the heir of the throne. Odette wasn't supposed to know, but she did. And when she had pressed the letter back into his hand 2 days ago, whispering, "It's sewn into the lining, no one will notice," he had looked at her like she'd handed him his life back. "I owe you," he had said. Now, with the robe complete and the gold threads tied off, she leaned back from the table and exhaled. The sewing hall was empty. Only the scuff of boots in the corridor reminded her she wasn't alone in the palace. She stood to stretch and nearly collided with him. "Xavier," she whispered, startled. He was flushed, breathing hard, hair damp from the rain. "They know," he said. "The letter." He nodded. "The chamberlain found out. He hasn't told the prince yet, but he will. I have to leave tonight." Odette's heart dropped. "You'll be arrested." "I know." She stared at him, the ink-stained hands, the quicksilver eyes, the fine waistcoat worn threadbare at the cuffs. He looked nothing like a royal tutor. He looked like a man on the edge of losing everything. "I have a carriage waiting behind the embassies," he said. "I need to get the letter back. If I destroy it, I might have a chance." Odette turned back to the robe. "It's finished." "Then let me take it." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "They'll search you. I'm the only one who can deliver it without suspicion." He looked at her for a long moment. "You do that?" he asked. "I already have." A pause. Then, quietly, "Why?" She met his gaze. "Because I believe in what you wrote." He didn't smile. But he said, with the softest breath, "Then I believe in you." By dawn, Odette stood in the Queen's dressing chamber with the robe folded over her arms. The Duchess of Teck nodded her through. No one stopped her. The robe was passed to the valet, who passed it to the footman, who laid it on the Queen's bed. The letter, sewn into the hem, was gone by noon. Burned by the prince's own valet, who had read Xavier's words urging the heir to oppose the tightening grip of the lords over Parliament, to protect the poor from the burden of new taxes, to remember that a crown was worn not on the head, but in the heart of a people. The letter had been a risk, but it had saved Xavier's life. By evening, he was gone. The palace whispered of his disappearance. Some said he'd fled to New York, others to Paris. Odette said nothing. She stitched sleeve cuffs and mended pearl buttons, and watched the coronation unfold like a play she wasn't invited to. But 10 nights later, a parcel arrived at her boarding house. Inside was a scrap of blue velvet, the same cut used in the Queen's coronation train, and a note. "Meet me beneath the rose trellis at midnight. The gardens remember. Xavier." She almost dropped it. That night, she crept out of her narrow room above the baker's shop, wrapped a shawl over her shoulders, and walked the long road back to St. James's Park. The guards had been doubled since the coronation, but she knew all the servant paths, every blind corner and hidden gate. She reached the rose trellis just past midnight. He was there, cloaked, waiting. "You came," she breathed. You remembered, he said. She stepped into his arms without hesitation. Where will we go? She asked. Anywhere you want. She looked up at him. I want you. He kissed her firm, certain, no longer forbidden. And for the first time since the robe had left her hands, she felt free. They left London before dawn, bound for Marseille by train. He had friends there, people who owed him favors. She had her needles and thread. Together, they would build something new, not a crown, but a life. Not woven from gold, but from faith. And love. Always love. The wind off the Mediterranean bit harder than Odette had expected. Marseille's port was a tangle of ropes and salt, with gulls circling like beggars above crates of oranges and copper pans. She held tight to the handle of her carpet bag, it seems aching with the weight of her shears and thread, and kept her eyes on Xavier's back as he led her through the narrow alleys behind the fish market. He didn't speak until they reached a shuttered storefront, with faded blue paint peeling from the doorframe. It used to be a bookseller's, he said, lifting the latch with a small brass key. The owner died 3 winters ago. His nephew owes me more than a few favors. Inside, the air was musty with old ink and dust. A single oil lamp burned on the floor beside a stack of ledgers. The shelves were still full, bindings cracked, titles in Latin and Greek, some in Arabic. Xavier stepped aside to let her enter first. You'll be safe here, he said, setting his satchel down. Odette ran her fingers over the spines. Do you miss England? He sat on the edge of a crate and unlaced his boots. Not yet. She unwrapped her shawl and hung it across the window. You left behind everything. I brought what mattered. He looked up then, and his voice softened. You. Odette didn't answer. She walked to the back of the shop, where a faded tapestry of St. George still hung, moth-eaten and half loose at the corners. Behind it, a second door led to a storage room. She opened it carefully. Inside, cobwebs clung to crates of parchment and a rusted printing press with its wheel half broken. I'll clean this, she said. If I'm to sew, I'll need space. He followed her gaze. There's light in the mornings, through that crack in the roof. I'll mend it tomorrow. They didn't share a bed that night. She slept on a cot beside the press, wrapped in her wool coat. He stayed in the front room with the lamp burning low, sketching something onto a sheet of parchment. No words passed between them after nightfall. By the third morning, she had set up a small work table near the back window. The air smelled of clothes from a spice merchant next door. Fabrics were scarce, but she bartered a velvet waistcoat for a bolt of muslin and 3 spools of dyed thread. She stitched handkerchiefs first, then cuffs, then delicate lace collars like the ones worn by the merchant wives along Rue Longue de Capucines. Xavier spent his days among pamphlets and ink, translating foreign newspapers and copying letters in neat, looping script. She caught glimpses of German phrases and names she didn't recognize. Once, a map of the Balkans lay folded beneath his elbow, with red lines drawn through Serbia and Montenegro. You're still watching The Crown, she said one afternoon, not accusing. He set down his pen. I watch because I care. You're not afraid they'll trace you? They won't look for me here. England's eyes are turned east now. Odette returned to her stitching, but her thoughts stayed with the words he hadn't said. Weeks passed. Their silences grew companionable. She learned the whistle he gave when he wanted tea. He learned the way her mouth quirked when a stitch fell wrong. They traded books for food and repairs, offered collar mends in exchange for firewood, and slowly, the neighborhood accepted them as an odd but harmless pair. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the terracotta roofs, Xavier came home with a cut above his brow. Odette dropped her needle the moment she saw him. What happened? Street boys. They thought I was a customs agent. She took a cloth and pressed it to his temple. You need to be careful. I was. They just didn't like my accent. She stood between his knees, dabbing blood from his skin. You should rest. Instead of answering, he reached up and caught her wrist. You haven't asked what I want from all this, he said. I assumed you'd tell me when you were ready. I want a life where I can speak freely, he said, and love who I choose. Her throat caught. And you've chosen? He nodded. That's dangerous, she whispered. I've lived in danger my entire life, he said. This is the first time I've lived in truth. Her hand trembled in his, but she did not step away. Then let's live in it together. He kissed her then, not with urgency, but with certainty. The room fell away. There was no thread, no throne, no exile, only the warmth of his palm on her cheek and the press of his forehead to hers. They were married in secret by the sea, beneath a limestone arch where the fishermen tied their boats at dawn. The priest was old and half-blind, and asked no questions. She wore a borrowed dress. He wore his father's cufflinks. They returned to the shop as husband and wife, and the world, for once, did not intrude. Inside the tapestry room, she unfolded a new bolt of silk, ivory and soft as breath. No commissions had come, but she stitched anyway. Not for queens or coronations, only for the life they were building, slow and certain, one honest thread at a time. By early spring, the coast near Marseille turned wild with windflowers, and the rhythm of the city shifted with the warming air. Traders from the interior began arriving with baskets of raw cotton and dyed wool, and Odette's hands grew red from the soft bleaching lime she used to prepare the fabrics. She had taken in mending work for two sisters who ran a perfume stall, and in return they brought her lavender oil and beeswax to soften the cracked skin on her knuckles. Xavier spent most mornings writing in the back room, his brow furrowed as he copied coded letters in Greek and Turkish. He didn't explain what they were for, and she didn't ask. When the bell above the shop door rang, she would pause her stitching, glance once toward the corridor, and wait until his footsteps returned to reassure her. One afternoon, as she traced a hemline with fine bone chalk, she heard him call softly from the other room. His voice was gentler than usual, and she wiped her hands before stepping through the arch. He stood at the small table near the bookshelves, holding a parcel wrapped in oilskin. "It arrived today," he said. "From Algiers." She took the package carefully. Inside, nestled between folded linen, was a bolt of indigo-dyed silk deep as dusk, with a subtle sheen that caught the lamplight. "It's from the wife of a French consulate clerk," he said. "She heard about your work through a merchant in La Joliette." Odette ran her fingers across the silk. It was unlike anything she'd handled before, looser in weave, but with a luster that shimmered like water. "She wants a dress?" "She wants a coat. For her husband's investiture." She sent measurements. Odette nodded slowly, mind already sketching the construction. "I'll need time. And a stronger needle." "She trusts you," Xavier said. "So do I." That night, they shared a bowl of lentils and black bread on the floor, as they had no chairs yet. He told her about the time he had been left behind in the Istanbul embassy garden as a child, and how the gardener had fed him quince jam with a wooden spoon while he waited for his father to return. She told him about the first time she ever touched brocade, the way it had made her feel like her hands were too rough, too undeserving. "You never told me how you learned to sew," he said, brushing crumbs from his coat. "I didn't," she replied. "I watched, then practiced, then stitched my own hand open and nearly lost the use of my thumb." He took her hand gently and turned it over, examining the thin white scar that crossed her palm. "You never told me that part. I was ashamed. You made a crown robe. You can't afford shame anymore." The weeks turned to months. The consulate coat took shape, its collar lined with cream piping and its cuffs embroidered in a two-tone fleur-de-lis. Odette worked in silence, humming sometimes to herself, the tune never quite the same. Outside, the air grew thick with the scent of cordwood and fish brine, but inside the shop, the silk gleamed like a promise. One evening, as she adjusted the sleeve length, Xavier entered with a slip of paper. "We've been invited." She looked up. "To what?" "A gathering. Not official, but important. I have work." "It's not for politics," he said. "It's for you." She hesitated. "I don't belong in those rooms." "You belong wherever your work is known. And it's known now." The gathering was held in an upstairs salon above a glassblower's workshop. Most of the guests were local artists, exiles, or tradespeople with unusual talents. A pianist played a slow, unfamiliar mazurka, and the air smelled of orange peels and wax polish. Odette wore a dress she had made from leftover merino modest, but with a finely pleated back that caught the candlelight. Xavier stood beside her, hand at the small of her back, guiding her toward a woman near the window. "She's the one who sent the silk," he whispered. The woman smiled, her teeth crooked but her eyes kind. "So you're the one who made it," she said in French. Odette dipped her head. "It was an honor." "You must come to Tunis," the woman said. "There's work. Real work. A consulate wedding, 200 guests. They want gowns that breathe, not corsets that strangle." Odette's breath caught. "I've never left France." "You'd have a room. A proper table. Your husband would come too, of course." Xavier said nothing. but his hand tightened slightly at her waist. Later, as they walked back through the quiet streets, she asked, "Would you go?" He took a long time to answer. "If you wanted it, yes." "I'm frightened," she admitted. "So am I." She stopped beneath a shuttered bakery, the scent of anise still lingering in the stones. But it wouldn't be the same as before. It wouldn't be hiding. "No," he said. "It would be becoming." They left for Tunis in early June, traveling by steamer. She packed her shears, her chalks, and the last of the beeswax. He carried a ledger, a leather-bound guide to Ottoman script, and a single folded letter bearing the seal of someone she didn't know. No guards followed them. No letters arrived in warning. They were no longer fugitives. They were makers of language, of cloth, of life. And from the moment the ship pulled from the harbor, their hands never let go. Tunis, 1911. The heat settled low and steady over the city, thick with citrus and the faint, iron scent of desert dust. In the European quarter, where French merchants had laid wide stone boulevards and built houses with shuttered balconies, Odette stitched in a room that opened onto a private courtyard, shaded by a single fig tree. Her work table stood beside the open doors, and the chirring of cicadas threaded through the stillness like fine wire. The consulate wedding commission had arrived with little ceremony, just a list of names, measurements, and a note in soft, sloping script. They wished to appear foreign, but not unfamiliar. Elegant, but not royal. She had read it twice, quietly, then folded it away into the lining of her bodice. Xavier had taken to tutoring the nephew of a local judge in the mornings. In the afternoons, he disappeared into the city's older districts, returning with notebooks full of odd, angular letters and sketches of arches and alleyways, sometimes with his hair dusted pale from the lime-swept streets. "You're mapping something," Odette said once, not looking up from the lace she was threading. "I'm listening," he replied, fingers absently turning the leather strap of his satchel. "Everything here speaks. Even the shutters. Especially the shutters." That evening, he brought her a small brass clasp in the shape of a date palm, its hinge worn but still strong. "It was part of a coat fastener," he said. "The tailor's son gave it to me. His father wore it when he fled the mountains in '85. She turned it over in her palm, the metal warm from his hand. "He survived. Barely. He never made another coat." She placed it beside her scissors. "Then I'll make one that remembers him." When the first gown was completed, a high-waisted, pearl-colored silk with a pleated overskirt and V-shaped neckline, Odette refused to send it out alone. She wanted to see how it moved in real light. The bride agreed to a fitting in the garden behind the consulate, beneath date palms and a trellis strung with muslin to guard against the sun. Odette stood silently as the bride turned in slow, deliberate circles. The silk caught the afternoon brightness like a quiet breath. The woman's mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief and murmured something in Italian. Later, as they walked back toward the apartment, Xavier asked, "Did it feel different?" "I didn't expect her to cry," Odette said. "She asked me how I knew her daughter's shoulders would slope like that in motion." "And what did you say?" "I told her I didn't know. I just listened to the fabric." The next morning, a pair of French-Armenian sisters arrived at her door with a request for engagement dresses, one in pale apricot, the other in cut-work cotton voile. Odette accepted with a simple nod, though inside, her thoughts turned briefly to the Queen's coronation robe, now locked away in London's royal archives, its hem still holding the memory of a letter no one dared speak of. Xavier didn't ask what she was thinking. He only reached for the chalk and drew a new pattern across the muslin pinned to the wall. "I've been offered a position," he said, as his hand moved steadily. "In the library at the Lycée, cataloging Ottoman archives." She paused. "That's French territory." "Yes. They'll know who you are. Eventually." She let the fabric fall from her lap. "You wouldn't be safe." He met her gaze. "I would be visible. That's different." She stood slowly, the silence stretching between them. "You want to be known. I want to stop hiding. But not from you." She crossed the room and took his hand, still warm from the charcoal pencil. "Then I'll sew your name into the lining of your coat. If they try to strip it from you, they'll find it stitched in." He touched her cheek, his thumb resting just below her eye. "You always make me into something stronger." "You were always strong," she said. "But now you're stitched to something that won't fray." By late summer, the wedding gowns were delivered, and the sisters returned with their fiancés in tow, laughing and arguing in a blend of Arabic and French. Odette's name began to pass through the upper streets of Bab el-Bar, spoken mostly in kitchens and among laundresses, never loud, never formally, but always with respect. One evening, as twilight settled like ash over the rooftops, Xavier returned carrying a bundle wrapped in saffron-dyed linen. Inside was a bolt of hand-woven wool from the interior mountains, coarse, dark, and uneven. "They say it can't be tamed," he murmured, laying it on her work table. She ran her hand against the grain. "Then let's not tame it. Let's let it speak." They stayed up late that night, her scissors clicking softly, his pencil scratching over parchment. They said little. There was no need. By the time the call to prayer rose from the distant minarets, the first sleeve had taken shape. Strong, exact, and defiant. Like them.